Amen. Dan's going to read our first lesson now.
Okay, the first lesson today is from Romans 12, verses 14 through 21. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. And don't think you know it all. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see that you are honorable. Do all that you can live in peace with everyone. Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will take revenge. I will pay them back, says the Lord. Indeed, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals of shame on their heads. That's from Proverbs. Don't let evil conquer you, but conquer evil by doing good. Thank you for the reading of the word.
Thank you, Dan. So today we come to the fifth and the sixth, which is the final in this series of when Jesus is saying, you've heard that it was said, this is the tradition you've received through the law. This is what it says. But I'm going to tell you this. He doesn't contradict the law, but rather he applies it more deeply, more radically. And he's going to do two of those. We'll focus just on the second of those this morning. But it's challenging for us and some of the most radical teaching that Jesus had. So here are these words from Matthew 5:38 through 48. Now you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, well, then hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile with them, go with them 2. Give to the one who asks. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've also heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you this, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on evil and good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those only who love you, what reward do you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that? Rather, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Wow, serious words. Let me say a little bit of just about that first one. Lex talionis. It's the law of retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That was articulated probably 1,000 years before Exodus was written, put down in language. It's an old one. It's this notion of limiting retribution. And in the Jewish Christian tradition, it comes from Exodus 21, where we read this. You're to take a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for an hand, or a burn for a burn. Now that can sound harsh in our ears, but really it was meant to limit the amount of retaliation and revenge that was inflicted upon one's enemy, that it go no further than the offense committed. So that Old Testament law set a limit on the harm one could do one's neighbor. Jesus turns that around and he blows off the ceiling on the good that you can do. We know at that time that Roman soldiers could conscript anybody on the spot to do a task for them like carry their pack for a mile. Jesus says, hey, if you're pressed into that kind of service, do 2 miles. If someone sues you for your shirt, give them your coat as well. He extends it deeper and says, this is kind of radical love of others, of your neighbor. But then it comes really into sharper focus in this next section where he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say this, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. Now, there wasn't a law that said hate your enemy, but that's how it had been interpreted. Because in Leviticus, when it says, this, let me read to you here. It says, don't seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, for I am the Lord. And the love of neighbor there was a nationalistic thing. Love your neighbor. It was taking liberty, folks who were feeling out the limits of the law, the very minimal that they were obliged to fulfill. It's like, well, okay, I love my neighbor, but I can hate my enemy. And actually, we see some evidence in the Old Testament, God's people defending their identity through violence towards neighbor and sometimes hard words spoken as well. But Jesus says more. He says this, love those who love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. John Piper, he says this about this. It's not that Jesus doesn't have two commands, love your neighbor and love your enemy. Rather, he says this, I have one command, and that is love your neighbor. And I mean by that, even if they are your enemy. Love others. That's a wild and revolutionary thing. This notion of love for others, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do, that was around long before Jesus, and it wasn't thought up by the Jewish people. We see it in Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi. It's all over the place. But what Jesus does is he extends it in this radical way. Love your enemy. This Wednesday night, some of the men from the church, as we often do on Wednesday nights, we gathered in my backyard around a fire, and as the sun set and the moon was rising, we talk about what's going on in our life. And I asked them this, we've got this passage I'm wrestling with this week. Love your enemy. What does that mean? Can you name your enemies? Who are your enemies? That's an interesting conversation for us to talk about that, those ones who are our enemy. This passage identifies at least three different kinds of enemies, or those who are outside of our little circle that we think of loving or being obliged to love. And the first are those who mean us harm, those who persecute us. You might have experience in a workplace or a neighborhood or even among extended families where people actively seek your harm. They want to hurt you, and they take actions to do so. Those who persecute you. That's a sad situation to be in and a hard one to bear. It's also true that even right now around this globe, followers of Jesus are persecuted. There are more folks who are persecuted for naming Christ as their guide and good shepherd now than back in ancient Rome during the day of the Colosseums. I have a friend I'm in conversation with who shepherds a network of pastors in rural India. And his folks at moments live in threat of their lives because of their public decision to follow Jesus and invite others to do the same. There are some who want actively to do us harm. But then secondly, Jesus says this, love your enemy, you do good to those who persecute you. You are children of your Father in heaven. And this is how he does it. He makes the sun rise on the evil and the good. He causes the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. The unrighteous, that's another category of those who are kind of opposed to us. Those who, because of the way they live, out of greed or selfishness or thoughtlessness, reckless behavior in one way or another, or even studied policies and practice that would kind of gather wealth to themselves at the cost of others, those are unrighteous ones. And they might be faceless or nameless in our world, but we know they're there. And we know they cause harm, especially to the most vulnerable on our planet. Jesus says, love those ones, because God causes the sun and the rain both to bless them, and so should you as his children. And then finally, this category that is the kind of the broadest It's just anyone who is not our own people. He says, if you only love those who love you, well, any little group does that. We could say any circle of thieves love those who love them. Or if you only greet those in honor, respect, be interested in the welfare of your own family members, well, you don't do any more than anybody else. But I'm asking you to go beyond your little circle, to include all of those who are just not part of your group. That's a high calling. It's kind of universal. The ones who intend us harm, the ones who just do harm, the unrighteous ones, and even anybody who's just not our own. You can't go out of your house without encountering somebody who you don't have like familiar relationships with, and yet Jesus says, greet them, honor them, love them too. Well, how do we do this? How do we live up to this big thing? And I think there are two main ways to do it. And one is change the way we're understanding who we are in this world. Change the way we think and perceive stuff. You know, Jesus says, I'm asking you to do this because you are children of your Father in heaven. Remember who you are. Get a bigger picture of what's going on. And those ones who are your enemy, or those ones who act unrighteously, habitually, remember they too are children of God. Maybe lost, maybe wounded, maybe trying to find their way in difficult ways, maybe even actively rebellious, but they too are children of God. Do you understand that this journey that you're on is not just one of private gain or personal advancement? It's God's work in all of creation to reconcile everything and everyone back into himself. He says, if you only treat kindly and with love the ones who love you back, you're as lost as the others because they do the same thing. He ends with this. He says, I don't know if you heard it when I read it, says, be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, that can seem like a problem, especially for some of us who might have trouble with perfectionism. Anybody out there have trouble with that a little bit? A few of you? Yeah. Well, he's not meaning perfection here is not the way we think about it, maybe, that absolutely everything is correct. But rather, the Greek word is teleos, and it means the fullness, the end, the maturity. He's saying, live into your maturity, the thing that you're capable of, the thing I'm calling you to. Do that with fullness, just like God lives into his fullness. So you too live into this fullness, this maturity that's there. So we reframe the situation. You know, Scripture gives us a couple of examples of this done in remarkable ways. Of course, Jesus on the cross, he's dying. He if anyone had enemies that he could name and look in the eye, it was probably Christ on the cross with the Roman soldiers and the Jews hurling insults at him, and perhaps only his own disciples who had left him and fled. But he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't see the big picture of what's going on. So forgive them. Even Stephen, who was the first martyr in the book of Acts, he's talking about Jesus and saying things people don't want to hear, so they drag him outside of the gate and they stone him. A brutal way to die. One rock at a time, knocking your body and bruising you. And yet he cries out, Lord, don't hold this sin against these ones. They're just lost children who don't know what's going on. But by your grace, I see a bigger picture. It's beautiful. Or as Dan read for us in Romans 12, love. If your enemy is hungry, what do? You feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. In doing this, you heap burning coals on their head. For don't conquer evil, or don't let evil conquer you, rather, but rather conquer evil by doing good. Practical things. Feed the hungry. Give a drink to those who are thirsty. There's that phrase, what does it mean to keep coals upon your head? That sounds like a horrible thing. I don't want coals on. I feel like I've got some coals on my head right now. The sun beating down. Well, we're not. The commentators are confused, but we know it doesn't mean this. Do them harm or cause them shame and embarrassment. That's not seeking their best interest. Oscar Wilde said this, always forgive your enemies because nothing annoys them more. This isn't a way of getting back at someone. It probably had to do in some way with blessing them. That's what he's saying. You will bless your enemies somehow. Well, how do we go about doing that? It's not just changing the way we think, but we're invited to change the way we behave. Cindy and I exchanged a little quote that has come into our lives in different ways, one source is Father Richard Rohr. And he says this, it's a very Franciscan thing. It might have been Francis who said it first. It says, we don't think ourselves into a new way of living. We live ourselves into a new way of thinking. And Jesus invites us to do that same. I was reminded this week of a minister and a newspaper columnist, George Crane, who tells a story of a wife who came to him and said, I need your help getting a divorce. And I don't just want a divorce. I want to get even. I'm learning to hate this man. Well, he's a pretty wise guy, George Crane. He says, let me tell you how to do it. Don't just get a divorce. I want you to do this. Go back home, and for the next 2 weeks, this is going to be great. I want you to make him think that you really love him. Go out of your way to pay attention to him. Any little positive trait, go out of your way to praise it. Be attentive to him. Make him feel like he's the center of your world. If it's possible to find any joy in his presence, you find it and let him know that it's really there. And after you've done that for 2 months, just when he thinks things are really great, then you can break the news. Pull the carpet out from under him. So she says, I like the way you're thinking. And she leaves believing she has an ally in her side. She's going to get back. And she goes home and does that for 2 months. And Reverend Crane doesn't hear anything from her, so he makes a phone call. Hey, you ready to go through with that divorce now? She says, what? No, we don't want a divorce. I discovered I really do love him. She lived herself into a new way of being. Isn't that amazing? C.S. Lewis made the same point in his little book, Mere Christianity. He says, don't waste your time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Just act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you are behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love them. If you ignore someone if you injure someone you dislike, you'll find yourself disliking them even more. But if you do them a good turn, you'll find yourself liking them more. We move our way into a way of being by doing it. That's what Aristotle said. If we could put this question to Aristotle, who is the person who loves their neighbor? What do they do? He says, well, the one who loves their neighbor is the one who acts lovingly towards their neighbor. How do I become somebody who loves my neighbor? By doing what someone does who loves their neighbor. By doing it. Jesus invites us to come and follow. We don't have to look very far to find examples of people who do this, who embody it for us in our own lives, whether it be our parents or family members. We can read about examples of the family members, survivors of mass shootings who forgive the perpetrators, or those who visit death row to forgive the one who took the life of a loved one, a child. It's all around. One of the most powerful and moving examples I'm aware of, maybe you know this, comes from the life of Ernest Gordon. He was a Scotchman, a soldier, World War II, became the chaplain at Princeton for quite a while. But he wrote a book about his time. He spent 3 years as a Japanese prisoner of war during World War II. And he wrote a book called Through the Valley of the Kai. And let me read to you just one little episode. His camp of POWs decided that they weren't going to just suffer and endure prison or this camp. They were going to learn to grow as humans. And so they practiced things to enrich their own life, to teach others, to be kind to their captors. And he tells this story of when the train that they were on, moving them from one prison camp to another, also included some train cars filled with wounded Japanese soldiers who were coming back from the front. He says this: "We found ourselves on the same track with several carloads of Japanese wounded. These unfortunate were on their way on their own without any medical care. They were no longer fit for action in Burma, and they had to be packed into railway cars, and they were being returned back to Bangkok. They were in a shocking state. I've never seen men filthier, uniforms encrusted with mud and blood and excrement. Their wounds, sorely inflamed, full of pus, crawled with maggots. Well, the maggots were probably doing good by eating the dying flesh and preventing gangrene, but it was apparent why the Japanese were so cruel to us, their prisoners. If they didn't even care for their own, why would they care for us? And the wounded men looked at us forlornly as they sat with their heads resting against the carriages, waiting for death. They'd been discarded as expendable, the refuse of war, and they were the enemy. And they were more cowed and defeated than we had ever been. But without a word, most of the officers in my section unbuckled their packs, took out part of their rations and a rag or two, and with their water canteens in hand, went over to the Japanese train cars. The guards tried to prevent us, but we ignored them, knelt down by the enemy to give water and food and to clean and bind their wounds, and grateful cries followed us when we took our leave. Thank you, thank you. I regarded my comrades with wonder. For just 18 months ago, we would have readily joined in the destruction of our captors had they fallen into our hands. But now these same officers were dressing the enemy's wounds. We had experienced a moment of grace there in this blood-stained railway car. God had broken through the barriers of our prejudice and had given us the will to obey his command. Thou shalt love. Well, now I can say this with quite a high level of certainty. I'm unlikely to meet anyone this week who wants to kill me. I'm unlikely to come across the path of anyone who would take my life. But I do know this. I can think right now of those ones who I would categorize as the unrighteous, those who live out of sync with God's will for his life and so harm others and harm the environment. It's also the case that I will not move anywhere this week without encountering people who are beyond my little family circle. And in every opportunity, I'm called to love those ones, to pray for those ones, to seek their well-being. I think we find our power to do that in the reminder, not just a mental reminder, but a life of participation in the knowledge that the God who calls us loves us and gave his life for us. That's why we do every month the same ritual of celebrating communion together, to be a reminder to us that even when we were in rebellion, even when we knowingly or not were marked as enemies of God, he sought our well-being and sacrificed on our behalf that we could be reconciled back, brought into the fullness of life that he calls us to. So I'm going to invite people now as we move towards communion. If you Christians know this, that the Christ who calls us, who gives us this command to love our enemies and our neighbors as ourselves, also supplies both the willing and the means to do it. Let us walk into that as far as we are able by God's grace this week for our good and for His glory. Amen.